Welcome to the Movement Driven Podcast with Dr. Greg Goldberger, where we help you bridge the gap between pain and performance. Each week, we'll share strategies, insights, and real-life applications to help you keep moving and stay driven. Now, let's get into this week's episode of the Movement Driven Podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Movement Driven Podcast. I'm Dara Sweat, here with Dr. Greg Goldberger. Greg, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. Doing some of my mobility stuff this morning that you and Elza have given me on my shoulder, making Doug do it with me as well.
Here we go.
Really started this thought in my mind that, we should really talk about shoulders today. We talk a lot about hips. We talk a lot about knees. But we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about shoulders. So I think that we should really dive into the shoulders today. What do you think?
Let's do it. Let's give it some love.
All right. Awesome. So we want to talk about multiple things about the shoulders. There's so many different facets of it, but I think today is probably just going to be like part one, because I think there's so much that we could really dive into with this.
Okay.
So from an anatomy standpoint, what makes the shoulder such a complex and vulnerable joint compared to the rest of the body?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand, like I for all my patients, regardless of what body part we're working on, I think you have to understand a certain amount of what's actually going on to be able to be compliant with your rehab program and understand why you're doing the things that you're doing. I think it does help the rehab process. So the education piece is important. And we talk about the shoulder, we actually call it a shoulder complex. And I think that word comes from kind of two meanings there. It's a very complex joint. And what I mean by that is, your shoulder joint itself is a ball and socket joint. And the socket is your shoulder blade, and the ball is the end of your humerus. And that is essentially your shoulder joint. But your shoulder joint is super reliant on all of these other components of your body to move in conjunction with each other. And if they're not, then the shoulder is kind of what starts to suffer. And so when we talk about what those components are, we have to talk about your thoracic spine, which is your upper back, your shoulder blade, which is your scapula, and how that's moving around your rib cage, how your rib cage is moving. Then we could talk about how your clavicle is moving. When you lift your arm overhead, your clavicle has to rotate in your sternal notch, which is attached to your sternum, which is your breastplate, which there's so much stuff going on where I probably should stop now and let you guide me with some more questions before I start confusing the people. But there's a lot of complexities there. And if one of those things is not moving the way it should, then something's going to suffer.
Yeah. No, I mean, I definitely can attest personally I have both of my labrums have been torn, not so badly that I had to get surgery. Luckily, my orthopedic doctor is very much hey, let's see what we can rehab before I cut you open. Although he loves to do that, but he's very honest in that way. So I've been able to, do some physical therapy as well as just, bodybuilding type stuff to really strengthen those muscles around the labrum. And I don't really have too many issues with it. But sometimes, especially doing CrossFit and depending on like what kind of lifts or workouts, like gymnastics movements we're doing, I definitely can feel some issues come up with it. So I know the shoulder has incredible mobility. I mean, from how I can do a snatch overhead to, how I can carry all of my groceries in one arm to, carrying my nieces and nephews on one side while also doing other things with my other arm. So what does it actually take to stay stable with so little structural support?
That's a great question. So if we talk about just that shoulder joint for a second and not the whole complex, right? So just that ball and socket joint. If we were going to imagine that, the way that they depict it in the literature, or the analogy that they use, is comparing a golf ball on a tee. The tee is the socket and the golf ball is the ball. Think about how stable that ball is on that tee. Gust of wind blows that thing right off. But if you think about like the ratio of how big and how shallow the socket is compared to the size of the ball, that's how easy it is to kind of roll out. And so we need a tremendous amount of dynamic support from things like the rotator cuff and other ligaments to provide static support, but mainly the rotator cuff in that joint to stabilize that joint and prevent injury. Now, we talk about that joint itself, but then we have to go into, well, it's not just that. we have to stabilize that scapulothoracic joint, which is where the shoulder blade meets the rib cage, meets the upper spine. If we have instability in that region and we don't have good control there, well, now we're going to have excessive movement through the shoulder joint itself. And that's where we get the breakdown. So that's where it comes back to, we have to address the whole complex at one and look at all of your mobility or stability issues through each of those regions to make sure that we do our job in preparing that joint for function.
Yeah. So it sounds like the scapula seems to be a key player in our shoulder motion. So how does it work together with the shoulder joint and the thoracic spine when we lift overhead specifically?
Yeah. Yeah. So when we lift our arm overhead, so if I just kind of raise my hand in the air, 2/3 of that motion comes from that ball and socket joint, right? And 1/3 of that motion comes from the shoulder blade rotating upwardly and around the rib cage. So we call that an upward rotation of the scapula, and that's actually responsible for 1/3 of that motion. If we kind of go further, that scapula cannot rotate or move the right way if the thoracic spine and its attached rib cage is not able to extend or rotate adequately. So what we have to do is look at thoracic spine, usually mobility, and then have stability of the shoulder blade. And then we need a combination of stability and mobility of the shoulder joint. Now, if we stay in kind of back to your question in terms of focusing on the shoulder blade, this shoulder blade is connected to our body via 17 different muscles.
Wow.
All right, just picture that. So the shoulder blade is, think of it like just suspended in midair, and it has maybe 2 or 3 ligamentous attachments to your clavicle and your humerus. And it's attached by your labrum. But other than that, 17 different muscles attaching to your neck, your cervical spine, attaching to your thoracic spine, attaching to your rib cage, to your clavicle, to your humerus, attaching to all of these different points. And so I picture this trapeze artist held up by all of these different strings in midair. And if one is starting to pull tight, or if one weakens, then something else has to compensate. And those compensations tend to turn into bigger and bigger problems and a snowball effect. And so now we have too much force going through two very delicate areas, such as the rotator cuff or the labrum, dera, and we start to have a breakdown of those tissues. So 9 times out of 10, the people that have shoulder problems also have some sort of shoulder blade. A term that we use is scapulodyskinesis, which is a fancy term for poor movement quality of the shoulder blade. And it's not necessarily a full-blown diagnosis for some people. I think of it as on a spectrum, but everybody that has shoulder issues tends to have some sort of little dyskinesia going on in this shoulder blade area. So we have to have tremendous amount of stability and control and coordination of that. And that's frankly what I see a lot of people is they lift up and they have too much of a shoulder hike. They have too much upper trap involvement. Their lower trap doesn't do enough, and another muscle called your serratus doesn't do enough. So we have to kind of balance that system and really stabilize and coordinate that shoulder blade first and foremost.
Yeah. So for the person who feels that pinch or tightness overhead, what would you say is their first step towards identifying and fixing the true root cause?
Yeah. So there's not somebody that comes in for that kind of shoulder blade pinching shoulder pinching overhead right in the front, top of the shoulder. People that are listening have shoulder pain. That's usually where it is for most people. When we come overhead, we get that pinching right in the front there. A lot of the time that's coming from the shoulder blade not getting out of its own way. So we think about like postural changes, right? So posture is huge for our shoulder patients. So if you can imagine really poor slouch posture, you're sitting down, you're slumped forward. What happens to those shoulder blades? Well, they round the rib cage, they come forward, and they also kind of tilt forward as if they were at the top of a roller coaster, at the very top, about to go down. And what happens is over time, those muscles kind of get used to being in that position. Those tissues get used to being in that position. Things shorten, things lengthen, things get quote unquote out of whack. Now you go to the gym and you lift heavy and you didn't get the proper mobility back and you can't get your shoulder blade back and down in good posture and lift adequately overhead. You're just pinching because that shoulder blade is still, forward and in a bad position. So the shoulder blade getting it out of its own way. And then we have to look at the thoracic spine. If the thoracic spine is not extending, then there's no way that I'm going to get my shoulder blade in the right position. So everybody listening right now, whether you're in your car, well, if you're in your car, wait till you're at the stoplight. But if you're at home listening, if you're sitting down, put yourself in really poor posture. Slouch forward like you were when mommy was yelling at you at 13 years old to sit up straight, and try to reach overhead. You can't get overhead nearly as much as you usually can. And if you really try to force it, it's not going to feel good on even a healthy shoulder. Now sit up really tall and look at how much motion you get and how you can get your shoulder way up higher towards the ceiling, or even start to get it a little bit behind you. I don't care who you are. You increased your motion just by sitting up taller. I don't have to look at you. I just know. So that shows you how much important that thoracic mobility is, to then allow your scapula to move and coordinate the right direction and the right way, to get out of the way of the shoulder joint, so that we have appropriate, what we call roll and glide of that ball and socket joint. The rotator cuff can be in the right position, not get pinched upon. All of that stuff is where we get to in the next episode, where we talk about impingement, rotator cuff tendonitis, tendinosis, tendinopathy, labrum, how all of those are kind of because of these postural faults, but we'll get into those specifics in part 2.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Dr. Greg. I really appreciate, and I'm sure some other people with shoulder issues as well appreciate the introduction to this little mini series that we have here on shoulder. And as you were talking about fixing your posture and your mobility, I definitely was doing that in my seat as well. And I can attest that you are correct. It did how.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, and we'll touch on the next one.
Awesome. See you guys.
Thanks for tuning in to the Movement Driven Podcast with Dr. Greg Goldberger. Want to see how we're helping people in Jacksonville bridge the gap between pain and performance? Head on over to movementdriven.com. Until next time, keep moving, stay driven.